chat for another few seconds, and then I'll count us
Okay.
down, and then we'll get going. So, you ready to
Okay.
go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect. Wonderful. Three, two, one. Today I have Shannon Harris with me, and Shannon, you are a singer, you're a composer, you're a writer, and speaking of the writing, you recently wrote a great book, very much a memoir about your life called "The Woman They Wanted: Shattering the Illusion of the Good Christian Wife." I'm super stoked to chat a little bit about this. It's just going to be a great conversation. But I would imagine there's many other things to you, Shannon. So who is Shannon Harris to Shannon Harris?
That was a great question, and thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, I am all those things. I think those are very much who I am. I'm an artist. I'm a singer. I'm a real creative kind of person. And then I think aside from that, I have learned since leaving the church that I am also a very strong woman. That the woman that I was in the church was really almost like I wouldn't say a performance because I really did think I was being who I was supposed to be, and I was trying so hard, but I had to work so hard to be small. And so Shannon Harris is very big,
Mm.
very big, very loud.
I love that. I love that. And I would imagine, and we'll obviously want to get more into your story, but I would imagine for so much of your life, you probably had to shrink yourself so that you weren't
Hmm.
so big. And so I would imagine it's quite
Exactly.
freeing to realize, no, I'm a big person, a big personality, and I love that about myself. I would imagine that's a pretty freeing moment whenever you get to
It,
that point.
it is freeing. I will say that 20 years of kind of minimizing yourself is very challenging to break from. It's a
Hmm.
default, it's so easy. But yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I look forward to getting bigger and bigger and louder and louder.
Love that. Love that. Obviously, this book is very much a memoir, but was there any research for this book that went into writing it? I'm just curious, like, what, like,
Yeah.
if there were things around, like, obviously, there's a lot of conversation around like purity culture. There's a lot of things going on with like deconstruction going on in this book, and so I'm curious, like, if there
Yeah.
was any research that kind of went into this book that maybe you didn't know about before. If there wasn't that much, maybe it was just purely memoir. You didn't really have to go searching around the internet for different facts or different reading different books to make your argument or whatever. I would imagine maybe there wasn't so much of that, but just out of curiosity, was there anything that you learned
Yeah.
about that anything like that in the book?
No, exactly. I think I was coming from this place where um, I was super self-absorbed in a healthy way. Like I had been so um, I spent 20 years really giving, 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 giving,
Hmm.
giving. And so I was coming from this place when I writing this book that was very focused on trying to figure out myself. I spent a lot of time alone. And I actually purposely didn't really delve into the whole deconstruction world. I didn't read a lot of books. I mean, I didn't read any books. I was really trying to hear my own voice
Mm.
and learn to listen to myself again. And part of that, I felt that was that one of the things that I felt was important was for me to actually kind of not be taking in tons of resources. Um, and so not really. It really is pretty much straight up memoir.
As you were writing this book, again, because so much of it's memoir, you're uncovering these stories like these documents. You're having to process through these things, and maybe some of these things are some of the first times you're processing some of these things, and maybe you've processed some of these things a lot of times. But I'm
Yeah.
really curious then for you, what was it like, or what maybe you learned something about yourself as you wrote the book, but really curious, just like that personal relationship that you had to yourself as you were going through the book writing process.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I saw this question that you sent me and I literally it's blank here. I It's blank. I I mean, while I was writing the book, I still was learning. I've heard some people say maybe Shannon wrote this book too early and I'm like, you know, since when is it not, when is there a right time to write about your own
Mm,
life? I mean, do you have to have perfect um perfect sight on it? I don't think so. Like, I think the important thing is, this book reflects where I was, at this time, and it doesn't have to say every word. Or um, I I think through the whole process of the book, there was a lot of pain and a lot of regret
mm,
that I let these things happen to me.
mm,
That was probably the hardest thing, that because there was this process of having to kind of sort out what was done to me and what did I allow, and why did I allow myself to be put in these positions. I wasn't raised like this. I was very supported as a child, all throughout my growing up years. I had wonderful teachers, wonderful influences. So why would I then really just kind of disappear and let everyone tell me who to be? So I would say regret is probably the most difficult part of writing this book, but
mm, mm,
and learning to be kind to myself, that was huge. I had to learn to say, you have to learn and say you did the best you could at the
mhm.
time. And yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I often think about that for myself and knowing the sort of things that I participated in growing up, and to know that at the time I really had no other option, or I didn't know any better, right? I'm just doing
Right.
the best I could at that time. And fortunately, I was introduced to other kinds of way of living in the world that made me realize, okay, maybe I need to move away from some of these things I'm participating in. But
Yeah,
certainly it's one of those things where, yeah, there's only so much you can know, and there's only so much you can really do.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, let's talk about the story. Let's talk about your story. Let's talk about kind of the beginning. Let's kind of like, obviously, I want to hear a little bit more of like you eventually, obviously, leaving evangelicalism, and
Hmm.
I don't know if you describe it as your deconstruction story or not, but that kind of
It's
thing. I
fine.
eventually want to get to. But what led us up to eventually, obviously, everything kind of imploding, and then now you, obviously, very much moving out of that world. I'm curious, what's sort of the lead up? What's the
How did I get into the
yeah,
church, kind of thing?
let's hear all about the beginning, the very beginning of the
Yeah.
story.
So I kind of liken this to Alice in Wonderland in the book. I'm fresh out of college, and I've just graduated with this degree in communications, but I had gone to performing arts school, and I knew halfway through college that I wasn't going to do anything with this communication degree, and that I wanted to be an artist still.
Mm,
Um, but I didn't really know how to make that happen. And I would say a real weakness of mine is being able to set small goals. Like, I've had to learn how to say, I want to get here. What are the small steps? So all to say is I was very ungrounded at this time, and I was going to go to I was thinking about going to New York or Nashville, and I had met through a friend of a friend a guitar teacher who started to evangelize me. And I was going to like write some songs, and then I was going to take him down to Nashville and go to the Bluebird Cafe or whatever, and that's what I was going to do. And so my guitar teacher becomes my friend. We both just graduated. Everybody's just kind of trying to find new friends, new way of living. And we get a gig together in the town, and then he starts evangelizing me, and eventually I visit the church. And that's where kind of I think to myself, I'm just going to peek my head in here and see what this is all about, because he really wants me to go. And then the next thing I know, I just like fell down the hole.
Did
So
you grow up in evangelicalism by any
I
chance?
did not.
Like you didn't have any relationship to it all prior to this?
None, none. So, I kind of laugh because even when I met Josh and there was all the purity stuff, like for me, I did not understand the massive social movement behind behind what I was doing, you know. I just I didn't know. So I
Mm.
was raised secular. I had a Catholic friend. I had like a Lutheran friend. I had one friend that went to some weird charismatic church. So I'd had a couple like experiences. But my mom, because she had been raised a strict Catholic, actually deliberately did not include religion in our upbringing. She didn't, she felt very stifled by the Catholic Church. And so she was like, you can decide what you want to do about religion later in life. And I kind of I kind of put a sticky note in my mind that I was going to figure out religion later. It was something I was curious about. So I think I had come to that sticky note. And when this guy was trying to get me to go to church, I was like, well, okay, I always wanted to handle this. So I'll
Mm.
go and see what I actually believe, you know, because I hadn't sorted out my beliefs about God. So yeah, so then I get what happens is I get roped in really quickly. At the time that I joined this ministry, they were developing a they were changing their name, they were changing their branding, they were growing, they were bringing in new leaders to launch a music label. They were really upping the ante on their goals. There had been a leadership split that of course we got none of the real details about, and it all seemed very positive. And within like the first year, I was in their brand new state of the art recording studio recording music for them.
Oh.
And that was amazing. And to me, that was this incredible opportunity. Bob Coughlin was the leader of music that they had brought in, and he's a very talented guy. He had had a real successful career. He developed and arranged the band, the group Glad, the a cappella group. It was like in the 80s. And he's just an incredibly talented guy. And so I immediately felt very connected to the music. And I think, you know, that it was a huge part of why I got in, because I was busy right away.
Hmm.
And before I knew it, I was singing in front of thousands of people. So I was in a way getting some of the things that I wanted out of life. And then I met Josh. And I really liked him right away. And about a
And
year
Josh was a part
later,
of this ministry as well.
he had been kind of courted, if you will, by the leader of the ministry to
Okay.
come and be the leader of this ministry. Saw Josh as a potential successor, absolutely
Mm.
went after him as his what do you call it? He was the Paul, and Josh was going to be his
Right. Like a
Timothy.
okay, sort of like an apprentice of sorts.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And so we meet, and then you know, Josh had his book had not come out yet. So I actually got the very first copy of that book. It had I was working at the church office. I had taken a part-time job there, and his shipment of books came like straight from the publisher. He had never seen his book in print before, and the box of books comes, and he opens it up, and I get the very first copy of
Wow.
this book.
So you
And
weren't
this is
even
before we were
dating,
dating.
and you weren't then dating then while he was even writing the book then, right?
Correct.
Okay, I see.
Correct. Yeah. So, but I liked him. And then because we were working, and because I saw him at the church office, and our church, the younger group was a small group of like 25 college age people, or, you know, young adults. I saw him a lot. So, you know, that's how things kind of progressed there.
Right. So the book
Uh,
obviously comes out and becomes a massive deal in evangelicalism. What sort of talk about that part of your story, knowing what what's about to happen after you get that first copy?
yeah. So what happens with our relationship is I think there's a couple factors. We've got CJ Mahaney, who's Josh's mentor, and he's the leader of this ministry, and he's putting tons of pressure on Josh to be an example to the younger kids in the church. You know, he really wants, he just wants it done in a certain way. And then on top of that, you've got Josh having this book and this audience, which I was not really aware of the significance of Josh's audience to him. And so, you know, he himself feels this pressure to live out these ideas in his book, but instead of just kind of doing this casually, we end up having to take it to the nth degree, which is
Right.
we're not even going to touch. Like we're
Right.
basically, you know. So then on top of that, you've got CJ kind of. I think my understanding is that he kind of pushed the courtship along fast. Our courtship was 10 weeks long from the moment we sat down and he asked me out to engagement,
Wow.
which is ridiculous. We probably spent like, I don't know, a handful of times alone,
Wow.
and we held hands. So looking back, I just think I just didn't understand that I was not central. I was just kind of, I was being swept up in some very aggressive goals that had nothing to do with me.
Right.
And yeah, and I just didn't see that because I was in love, and I wanted this relationship. So yeah.
The purity culture piece to this, especially considering you didn't grow up in any of that at all,
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
was your relationship to that part of it that you just were like, I would imagine like at some point you're like, I love this guy and I want to do what I need to do in order to be in love with this person, but I would also
Exactly.
imagine like you're also like, what the hell is going on? I can't even like hold his hand. Like I would imagine like you in that moment were probably, I'm guessing, experiencing this like there's just like a lot of weird things going
Totally.
on. But I'm curious, like what's your story around that part of it?
Yes, that's so insightful because that's exactly what I was feeling. I was like, well, the background too is that I was new to the church. So I was kind of believing that everybody else knew how to be godly. So I was kind of feeling all this pressure. But also like in a good way. I was like, okay, I'm learning to be godly and people are telling me how to do this. So that's kind of like the background. So, but where I was actually coming from was, I had lost my virginity in high school. I was not weirded out by sex or sexuality. Like I think I had a pretty healthy sexual ethic, but I knew that for Josh, like the fact that I was coming to this relationship with past experience, which is kind of a double standard because Josh also had a little bit of experience. So it's just, but
Mm,
the woman's experience is always kind of elevated
right.
to the witchcraft.
Right.
um, so I kind of came to it with this sort of patronizing, like, okay, all right, I want this guy, and this is kind of really important. I think this is kind of silly, but I'll do it because I really love, I really want this person. I really love this person, or I think I love this person. So it was a little bit straight down the middle, like me trying to live a different way because I had been shamed to death that my lost virginity was this huge deal,
Right.
and that I had taken something away from my future husband, and I felt shame for that. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was supposed to be this amazing gift that I gave my husband, and I stole it from underneath this unknown person." It's
Mhm.
just like, so there was the shame, and then there was also me trying to do better, and then this kind of, but the I think the real me was this kind of like, okay, this is so silly, but okay.
I would imagine there's got to be some level of like difference when it comes to like the sexual trauma around purity culture from somebody who grew up in it versus someone like yourself where you later on in life got introduced and essentially groomed into it. I and I don't know like what your relationship with other people who, especially other women who have experienced some sort of either sexual trauma or shame
Yeah.
around themselves because they were grown up in it. But I'm curious, like, have do you notice that difference between your own experience of later on coming into purity culture versus growing up into it? Like, have you noticed that difference between yourself and other women who obviously grew up in it? I'm curious around that. Like, if you notice any difference, or is it all the same? I'm just really curious around that.
I think it is really different. I think when I deconstructed and I had the way I look at it is I had handles to grab onto of what it looked like to be an independent person with my own body and my own choices and um, a young woman who has been born into a fundamentalist Christian family and is essentially owned by her father and then goes maybe perhaps straight to a husband has never had the experience of knowing what it's like to make many choices probably I honestly I think I had as difficult as my story is I remember being very grateful that I had this what I call this handle of me like something to grab onto that that I knew and that felt familiar. It's like this version of me that just that just kind of lived without overthinking, I guess is kind of part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I
So,
I do I noticed a big difference.
mm-hmm. We've talked obviously a little bit about the early part of your relationship with Josh, and obviously that being around the time that the book comes out. And then, I don't know how long exactly it is. I'm guessing it's somewhere around a decade from like those early 2000s period when you all got married to whenever and then the ministry you said it
Yeah,
imploded around
it's about 11
2011.
or 12 years exactly,
So yeah,
something
right
like
around
that.
a decade. During that decade, and you've got the phrase even in the subtitle of becoming a good Christian wife. Like, what was that process for you to not only move from like being the kind of like almost like a poster child of like courting and purity culture,
Yeah.
at least a poster child from like being the woman that's in that world, to now you're moving into this status as the good Christian wife. Like, what was that transition like? What was that experience like of now having to essentially force yourself into being this quote unquote good Christian wife?
Mhm. Wow. Well, I mean, that is essentially what the entire book is kind of detailing, and it's hard to just boil that down into like,
Yeah, you've got
you
over
know,
200 pages about it. I'm sure like
that's
a few
that's the
minutes aren't going to
story.
suffice.
Yeah, and that really is the story I was trying to tell. Because I, at the end of the book, well, I don't want to give it away, but um, at the end of the book, I'm just arriving at like this version of me where it's
Mm,
like, okay, I'm back to myself. Um, so that is the story of the book, and it's just there was because I was marrying the next leader. There was tremendous amount of pressure put on me. I was very watched. I would get confronted for the smallest things. And I really adopted a survival mode. I found out later from my therapist that, I developed coping strategies, which meant like ignoring my feelings, ignoring everything I felt. Really, I was ignoring everything. It was and I am very much I think a couple things, an all or nothing kind of person. I really give myself to the things that I give myself to. Um, I, you know, I can be an intense person, and I also am very persevering. So I think coupling all of that meant that I really denied myself hardcore, and just did what I was supposed to do. And I also think the ministry was hiding stuff. And so there was a tremendous amount of
Mm.
fear that I had. I was picking up all this, a lot of the pressure I was feeling, I think, was their fear that I don't know. I don't really, I still don't have all the facts, they
Mhm.
won't open themselves up to actually be examined for these sexual abuse allegations. All I know now is when the church imploded and the allegations came to light, my story actually made more sense. I
Mm.
was like, oh, this is probably why I was not given any voice or any position. This is why I was really asked to isolate myself. I was told
Mhm.
I couldn't talk to my best friend about stuff that happened in the church.
Mhm.
But I thought we were talking about, like, I don't know. I was new to the church, so I certainly didn't think we were talking about sexual abuse stuff that could come up, and
Right.
but essentially I'm having to kind of fold in, and I really do that. I kind of, the first year of my marriage, I kind of just, I remember just sort of collapsing a lot of my own goals and
Mm.
dreams for my life. And then of course you start having kids, and for the next, if once you have two kids, there goes a decade, it's like, if you're a stay-at-home mom, you're busy for 10 years.
Mhm.
So I was really busy. I have three kids, and homeschooling was a big part of what Josh wanted. So I was extraordinarily busy with that, and also with being a pastor's wife. So I would sometimes go from like 7 in the morning. I've got my kids, I've got breakfast, I've got homeschooling. Homeschooling's done, clean up. Then we've got guests coming. I've got to cook dinner somewhere between 3 and 5, and guests are coming at 5:30 or 6 or 7 or whatever. I mean, it was insane, the schedule. And I think in some ways I didn't actually ever have even time or space to think
Mm.
for a long time.
Mhm. At any point during those years, because you didn't grow up in the evangelical world, at any point did you kind of think to yourself like, life could have been really different had I not, gone into this world. We were just talking about like the person that may have grown up fundamentalist and then gets handed off to their husband. Like they don't know a world outside of purity culture and being the good Christian wife. Like they don't know a world outside of
Yes.
that. But you again experienced what it was like to not be in that world. So did at any point in those like 10 years of you now becoming the good Christian wife, quote unquote, did you kind of ever have these like doubts or questions around like, God, life could have been really different had I like not totally just like almost got sucked into this?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I'd say about that. The first is that I was extraordinarily committed to the idea of never getting a divorce.
Mm.
My parents had divorced when I was 10 years old, and it crushed me. It just undid me. I had no idea you could just kind of like end a family. And our family
Mm.
had been really tight, at least from my perspective. And I didn't see it coming. There was no fighting, there was no nothing. My parents actually are still friends to this day, and they handled it really beautifully. But
Mm.
as a 10-year-old, it was devastating. And so I went into my marriage. So one of the answers is no, I didn't. I didn't, because I was not going to ever rethink this decision. It wasn't a decision I was ever going to
Right.
think about. It was made, and I'm in it for do or die. That said, the thing that kept cropping up for me was my unhappiness that I wasn't doing music. I wasn't. I mean, even when I was a musician for the church, I was doing their thing, and I think in my heart of hearts, I knew I had my own thing, and that was the thing that kept coming up, because I started to have to just talk to myself like, I say in the book, I'm walking around about 10 years in, and I'm really starting to feel unhappy. I'm unsatisfied. I'm doing things that everybody else wants me to do, but I'm not doing the things that I'm supposed to do. And and as a creator, as a creative, I was just starting, I think I was just starting to explode with unused creativity.
Mm,
And so I was becoming very unhappy and um, really losing vision. I was having to, like, I would go and I would just try to re envision myself or what I was doing. So it was really the music and my dream, because ever since I was like 3 years old, I really did feel I had a purpose, and that purpose involved performing arts and me having my own audience. I kind of like had this vision of myself, even when I was really, really young, of me being on stage. It was just bizarre, but it had always been there. And I do believe that is part of my purpose, a big part of why I'm here on earth.
mm,
So it kind of kept calling out to me.
mm.
And
Yeah,
that
talk
was the
about.
thing I questioned.
Mm. Yeah,
Like,
I
why
mean,
why am
especially
I
if
not able to do that? Yeah.
right. I mean,
Sorry.
obviously knowing like how much of the music side of you was so important, even going into the ministry, right? Like that was part of the reason why probably it drew you in, because they had the recording
Right.
studio, and and to then all of
Totally.
a sudden, with like within the matter of probably a year or so, you're having to essentially neglect that part of your life altogether. It's just got to be such a difficult part of it, because that's the main reason why I even started going to the church.
Right. Well, and actually, I did it for quite a long time. I did
Okay.
get to do music. I did record for them for probably about a decade. I was actually doing quite a lot. But when Josh actually got promoted to be the actual senior pastor, that is when it drastically changed for me. I had 3
Mm,
kids at that time. This was, I think, 2006 or 4. And suddenly, Sunday mornings, it was not an option for me to sing. It wasn't an option for me to travel. And that did play a big factor, because after 5 years of that, I was kind of dying.
mm, hmm. Well, let's move now
Yeah.
towards the sort of second chapter of your life at this point, or at least this part of your life. Uh, Obviously, things drastically change for you to the point where you're at now, and I would love to hear kind of like the story of from that point. I'm guessing around 2011 is maybe when things really
Hmm.
start to change for you to where you're at now, because certainly where you're at now is very different than where you were around 2011. I mean, you have the naked pastor writing endorsements for you. Things must have changed. So yeah, I want to hear that part of the story. That this sort of what feels very hopeful to me. That this hopeful side of the story of things very much changing. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma involved. There's a lot of tragedy, a
Yes.
lot of drama. But I'd love to hear from that point to where you're at now.
Yeah. Um, okay. So kind of during that season when I'm pondering my unhappiness, that's when the church basically crumbles. And what happens is that, in a sense, it opens the door. Couple things happen at that time. The leaders that had exerted so much control over me actually left. They were no longer on the plantation.
Mm,
They packed up and left, and that was a big part of the division. I lost all of these relationships, which of course was this really hard part about it. But at the same time, the church crumbling allowed me to be free. No
mm,
longer did I have these people who had been watching me like a freaking hawk.
mm,
And so something really lifted there. The other thing that happened is that at this point, Josh was also getting tired, and we weren't sure we wanted to stay in ministry, because it was the church split and then the allegations and that all, and there had been stress before this. So we're talking now at this point, we've been 6 years of under tremendous stress or
mm-hmm.
something like that. Don't quote me on the numbers. I'm not an exact person.
There's a reason why you're an artist and not a mathematician, right?
Thank you. So we decide this was a really huge moment. Nobody ever went outside of our ministry for counseling or advice. And that's what happens in these churches. It's just
Mm-hmm.
a total bubble. Your doctor's in there, your counselor, your sex therapist, your marriage counselor, your everything is in the bubble. And Josh must have heard about these counselors, and there's even pushback on the team for us to go see these counselors to get advice about ministry, whether we're going to stay in ministry. So we spend, I say we're going. We've got to go, because at this point I had been dying for years, and Josh was only just starting to die, I think. So we go and we meet with these guys for an entire weekend, and these guys specialized in working with burnt out pastors, and so they've worked with some of the most influential pastors of gigantic churches in the United States, and very experienced. And we go in, and right off the bat, they see me as a separate person from Josh, which is literally like the first time that happens, or has happened since I joined the church, since I married him. I have like a little funny skit that will eventually be a comedy piece where my name is actually his wife, and I don't have a name of my own. So they said my name. They asked for my story. They asked for, how did I feel? What did I want? And that was the big question they threw out that I left with that weekend. It was permission to ask the question, what do I want? And no one would ever give that permission to a woman in my church.
Mm-hmm.
No one would ever ask the woman what they wanted. It was just it wasn't really on the table. Not even in small things a lot of times, for me. So that was sort of the thing I needed to be able to reconnect with my own, I guess, agency and authority. And so I started to do that. And we decide not to go. We asked for sabbatical. We don't get it. We don't get the 6-month sabbatical. We get a 3-month one. And I said I wouldn't go back for 3 months. So we decided we're going to go to, Josh wants to go to Regent and wants to go back to the West Coast. And in Vancouver, it's like there's nothing. It's like all the things propping us up are suddenly removed. And it's like almost like a blank slate. And it's really there that it's so still and quiet. I have no friends. I have very few friends. I'm meeting people, but it's minimal. I start to experience the after effects of the trauma. I start to cry. I start to feel things again, and I start to kind of believe my own perspective, and I start to assert myself, and I start making goals. I released an album, and I really just started kind of taking these little steps. So there was a lot kind of crumbling at that time, but getting away from the church stirred up a lot of things. So of course, when you change things in your life, when you're making lots of decisions, important values kind of come to light. What's important to you, what's important to me. And that was kind of happening. And then basically what happens is I have this kind of what I call the Barbie moment. I have this Barbie moment where I'm like, if you've seen the movie, you've seen that moment where all the Barbies are like waking up, and then they start running to each other, and they're like, wake up, you're in like this patriarchy thing,
Mm-hmm.
My favorite scene in the movie is where Weird Barbie holds up the shoes, and she's like, no, you have to choose these. That was my story. It's like, you have a choice, but no, you actually have to choose this one. So the Barbie moment, I realized that this concept, this whole thing, it's related to my dream in the music. I somehow I connect the dots, that this biblical womanhood, this ideal that's been pressed on me, isn't good. It isn't for me. It wasn't ever for me. And it was actually hurtful to me, because it took away something from me that wasn't evil, and it wasn't sinful. It's not evil or sinful for me to have my own career. And I don't know why I didn't see it before. But that at that moment, that changes everything for me because I realized that the whole system was not set up for my good, and
Mm,
I will have to speak on my own behalf and make sure I get my own good.
mm,
So that kind of, and then I think with that, I'm also realizing that the motives of CJ, that CJ's motives possibly were very mixed. And of course, that kind of makes me have to relook at my own personal story, my
mhm.
marriage, the origins of my marriage and my
Right.
relationship, because he was incredibly inserting himself in that time.
Mhm.
So it kind of unearthed a lot of stuff for me.
Mhm. Mhm. What happened after that Barbie moment then? Like obviously things it sort of is like this light that turns on and it's like holy shit, now I can't unsee this.
Yeah.
And your life has changed very dramatically, there
Inside, at least.
yeah, like what talk about that part of that story of just like all the different changes maybe that you'd like to share about that have happened since. I would imagine changes that have like been for the best for you.
Yeah. Well, there was obviously a lot of navigating. Josh was changing too. So there was a lot of navigating I would say this was really still an undoing time because
Mm,
I undid my beliefs about the church, but then my marriage had to undo too. And so those were kind of together, but also separate.
mm,
So it was actually a very, very hard time for me. I fell into huge depression.
mm,
I have my original title for the book was The Year I Sat in Bed.
mm,
And it was like, I just felt like I didn't know what to do. There was so much confusion. I was really kind of hanging on to what I call the good woman.
mm,
I still wanted my marriage to work out. I still, I was hanging on to that for dear life, honestly, kind of at my own expense. Um, and so I would say it was this kind of very strange time where I'm kind of pressing, I kind of look at myself as this, like I'm a container and I can only hold so much space for the good woman and for the real me.
mm,
And what I felt like was that the good woman was kind of getting pressed out. At the more I filled up with my real self and my authentic self and the things that I wanted to do, the less I had room for the good woman. And so the whole dynamic or the whole balance of the two of us living inside me was shifting. um, I released an album, which was really incredible for me. I started writing music, and I would say that was absolutely everything because basically it was a way that I was saying, no, I'm not actually a pastor's wife. I mean, maybe I was that, but I'm really an artist. That is who I've always been, and that is what I'm going to be.
mhm,
And I'm going to start doing that. And that's what I did. So writing the music, I figured out I learned how to write songs and I started learning music software and I went and recorded this album and um, I was I was taking actions and that was really new for me because in the church I had been very passive.
mhm,
So yeah.
mm. Where would you describe yourself now, kind of maybe spiritually? Like, is it something where Christianity is still something that you hold on to and care about? Does it feel like you've kind of you're no longer interested in that part of your spiritual life? I'm just curious, kind of like where you feel maybe spiritually now, given this entire story.
Yeah, I feel like I just don't want to give time to
Mm,
it anymore. It's like I don't feel like I need to know what I really believe. I think other people want to know what I believe way more than I really care to explore. Like
yeah.
I feel like I have explored this. And certainly when my faith was deconstructing, I was reading about Catholicism, and I was trying to understand some other, I had taken religion in college. So, but the bottom line is that I feel like that life was so unbalanced that the flip side of that is I need to give my time now to the stuff that really didn't get any time and attention. You know, in a perfect
Mm,
world, you have a balanced life. You've got some religion, you're also doing the things you're supposed to be doing, and there's no, but my life wasn't balanced. So to me, that means that now is also unbalanced.
mm,
So it doesn't mean I would never go to church. I've been to church a couple times. Right now, there's still a reaction, you know, when I hear scripture, and there's just
mm,
a lot that comes up for me that is
mhm.
painful. So I'm kind of I'm kind of focused on other things, and
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's just it's really interesting to hear so many people's journeys like that. You know, obviously yours was sort of like in a different status of a lot of people's journeys, but
yeah,
you know, many of us grew up in purity culture. Many of us uh,
right,
believed a lot of the things that we all believed. You know, when we were in evangelicalism, and then for all of us to undo those beliefs and have a journey in that, and then you know, some of us end up still identifying with Christianity and we find a different way of being
right,
Christian, and some of us leave religion altogether or maybe find a different religion or whatever it might be. But it's really interesting how
exactly.
that part of the journey is so different for so many people, at the
It
same time
is.
knowing that so many of us come from the same kind of cloth of purity culture, of evangelicalism, of those types of beliefs. So it's just it's really interesting in how so many different journeys can uh, kind of um, how so many different journeys can kind of happen you know, once you leave evangelicalism.
It's true, it's true, and I think that's healthy because that's kind of showing that people are really taking the path that feels true to them.
Hmm.
And that's why it frustrates me when, you know, when there's this whole kind of like, this is how you should deconstruct, or this is, it's just like, no, no.
Hmm.
Just
Hmm.
let people do what they need to do.
I mean, certainly a lot of the people that wrote endorsements for your book, you know, sort of knowing the world that you're in now, it seems like a lot of those people have very similar journeys as yourself of having this kind
Hmm.
of deconstruction experience. And yeah, it just seems really really important in particular that folks like yourself tell you know, share their stories. You know,
Yeah,
especially you know, knowing the sort of status and level of that you had in that world, and for you to go through this very similar journey that a lot of us who, you know, didn't, you know, weren't partnered to somebody who had this $1 million or you know, multi-million dollar million copies sold book or whatever, right? Like
right. I know what you
there
meant.
is a level of status there that is really important then for that kind of person to share their story. You know, and we all need to share our stories, our deconstruction stories. I think it's all really important.
Absolutely.
But to especially hear people that were very, very participatory in those systems, and even had some level or status that elevated them a little bit more. Especially those folks, I
Yeah,
think, need to share those stories, because yeah, it
totally.
feels like it could be so disconnected for someone like myself to think like, oh, like all those leaders, they all believe the same sort of thing, and they don't know what it's like to go through deconstruction. But certainly your experience, even at that level of having that elevated leadership, you know what that experience is like as well.
And that was one of the reasons I wanted to share my story. Because honestly, from a personal standpoint, I did not desire to elongate my public life in that world, from that world. Like,
Right.
there's nothing I wanted to do less than talk about, you know, these hard things. And it
Hmm.
was, in some ways it was really embarrassing, at one point. You know, I'm like, I we're gonna get a divorce, and I this is so mortifying.
Mm.
And but you know, it was also so incredibly freeing afterward, because it's like, well, I cannot fail anymore in like so many people's eyes, and in a way that's like so releasing, because it's like, I'm done. I'm written off. So, you
Hmm.
know, that was healthy. But I did want to say that that was, I think, part of why I wanted to write the book, because I realized that when I was in the bubble, all those stories were dismissed. It was like, don't read this book, don't read that book. These
Mm-hmm.
books don't,
Mm-hmm.
and I can remember that very distinctly, that the books were everything. Like, we had this bookstore and it was highly controlled, and people read books before they put them, they had readers that would okay them. And so I felt like, and then the other thing is, I was learning things, like women were reaching out to me from my ministry saying they were in other states. Like, I had one woman say, I was told to be like you by my pastor,
Mm-hmm.
and she was in like 5 states away. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that I don't think I comprehended how I was being basically used as a model, as a mannequin for so
Mm-hmm.
much of that. I don't think it really, I don't know. Maybe that's not true. Maybe I did. I certainly didn't understand that people were telling other women to be like me. That was ridiculous. And I was really upset when I heard that. Um, and so for those couple reasons, I felt like it's really important that women tell their stories, because their
Mm-hmm.
women's stories have been squashed for ages throughout, um, you know, life and in our culture. The only way we can really, it's just so important for us to hear each other's real stories, and so we can feel less alone. And yeah, like as I have talked to even my mother and like my aunts and my friends, the more open I have become, the more I've learned that a lot of women have experiences that they're not talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that I think has been really interesting to me, and I think it's, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I
So I
mean,
think,
there's a very good chance that some of those women that were told to model themselves after you were probably having the same sort of doubts and questions as you were having. And for
mhm,
them, for that person to know now, wait, all that entire time Shannon was also having these doubts and questions that I've been having, and for you
mhm,
to share that part of your story, I think empowers that person that may at one point in their life been told, actually model yourself after Shannon. I think that is such a freeing and empowering experience for people to know even Shannon was having that experience of these doubts and questions about whether it's my
yeah.
faith or my marriage or how I'm supposed to be in the world. I think it's just so important, and I think you sharing your story empowers those folks so much.
I hope so. I really do.
Well, sort of along those lines, then, how do you hope this book inspires and liberates its readers?
I think you just said it. I really do. I really just felt like it was important to share my story. I want other women to share their stories. I think being as open and honest and authentic as we can be helps each other. I think, we live in a patriarchal world that makes it really hard for women. We're kind of starting out the race already so behind. And I didn't write the book with these like distinctive takeaways. I really wanted women, men, people of all genders, to get what they wanted from it. If they wanted to read it, I didn't have like a plan, except that I wanted it to be freeing and encouraging.
Mm,
So yeah.
love that. Love that. Shannon, last question. How can listeners get connected to you, your work? Where should they get the book? Where can they get the music that you record and release? Yeah, all the
Um,
things. How can people get
okay.
connected to you?
Thanks. Well, I'm kind of in transition right now, but I have a website. I have some music on Spotify. I have a couple of videos on YouTube that are really out, a while ago. But I do a lot on Instagram, a lot of silly characters and stuff like that on Instagram. And you can get the book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the usual places. Uh, and in the future, I'm really just trying to work out what I'm going to do next. So a little bit in between, but I'm hoping to develop some kind of musical comedy, whether that's with other people or just alone. It might be a one woman show. I don't know.
I love it. That's just wonderful. So, well, Shannon, thank you so much for writing the book, sharing your story. Obviously, this is a story that connects to a lot of people. Especially those of us
Thanks.
who grew up in evangelicalism in the 2000s. Your story is so connected in that way, and to hear you share your story now, knowing the doubts and questions that you had, and how much that relates to so many of us. I think it's just so important. So, thank you so much for writing the book and talking a little bit more about it with me.
Thank you, Mason. This is amazing, and I think you're doing an amazing job.